Late 1941. Over the mountains of Yunnan province, a formation of sharp-nosed fighters climbs into the haze, their engine cowlings painted with the snarling teeth and eyes of a tiger shark. Below them, a nation is burning. China has been at war with Japan for 4 years, and its air force lies in ruins. What rises now to meet the Japanese bombers is not a Chinese squadron. It is a band of American volunteers, resigned from their own military, flying under a foreign flag paid by a foreign government for a war their own country has not yet officially joined. This is the story of the American Volunteer Group. This is the story of the Flying Tigers. By the summer of 1937, Japan had turned its military ambitions fully upon China. Shanghai fell. Nanking fell, and with each captured city, the Chinese Air Force, already outdated and outnumbered, was worn further toward extinction. Obsolete biplanes and a handful of mismatched fighters purchased from half a dozen different nations stood little chance against the modern, disciplined squadrons of Japan's naval and army air services. China needed pilots. China needed modern aircraft. And China needed them fast. Enter Claire Lee Sheno, a former U.S. Army Air Corps captain, opinionated, hard-driving, and largely dismissed by his own superiors for his outspoken theories on fighter tactics. Sheno had retired from the American military, only to be recruited as an aviation advisor to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang, who herself took a personal hand in overseeing the reconstruction of China's air arm. He arrived in China in 1937 with a mandate to assess and rebuild the shattered Chinese air arm. What he found convinced him that China's survival in the skies would require more than advice. It would require pilots. American pilots. Through 1940 and into 1941, as the war in China dragged into its fourth grinding year, Sheno lobbied Washington for a bold and unprecedented solution. With quiet backing from President Roosevelt, an executive order was signed permitting U.S. Army, Navy, and Marine pilots to resign their commissions and volunteer for service with a private American military aviation group under contract to the Chinese government. Officially, the United States remained neutral. Unofficially, the door had been opened, and a small group of Washington officials worked quietly to see that it stayed open. Recruiters fanned out across American air bases with an offer few had heard the likes of. Combat pay far exceeding standard military wages, roughly $600 a month for a pilot. More than double typical service pay. A bonus of $500 for every confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. Adventure in a distant war. Roughly 100 pilots, along with more than 150 ground crew and support staff. Mechanics, armorers, radio operators, cooks. Signed on. Many not fully certain what they were signing up for, or where exactly they were going. Recruitment posters and word of mouth spoke only vaguely of a special assignment overseas. They sailed for Asia in secrecy, traveling under false passports listing them as missionaries, teachers, and businessmen. Ships slipped out of San Francisco carrying men who, on paper, no longer belonged to any military at all. Their destination, Toungoo, Burma, a remote airfield carved out of the jungle, where training would begin far from prying eyes and closer to the front than any of them yet realized. The aircraft waiting for them was the Curtiss P-40, a rugged but unglamorous fighter that the U.S. Army itself had largely passed over for its newest frontline squadrons. It was not the fastest fighter in the sky, nor the most maneuverable at altitude. It lacked a two-stage supercharger, limiting its performance above 15,000 feet. But in Sheno's hands, it would become something else entirely.
Get him in the air now!
Sheno had spent years studying Japanese aviation, flying observation missions himself over Chinese battlefields. And he understood something few Allied commanders yet grasped. The Japanese Zero, nimble and deadly in a turning dogfight, was a machine built for one kind of fight, lightly armored, thinly built, optimized above all for maneuverability at the cost of structural toughness. Schnell intended never to give it that fight. He drilled his pilots relentlessly in a doctrine built around the P-40's actual strengths. Diving speed, rugged airframe construction, heavy armor plating behind the pilot's seat, and concentrated firepower from wing-mounted machine guns. Never turn with a Zero. Dive, strike, and extend away using superior speed. Fight in pairs, never alone, covering each other's tails, a formation the pilots came to call the sandwich. It was tactics born not of textbook doctrine, but of hard analysis and first-hand observation, and it would prove to be the difference between life and death for pilots facing an enemy fighter that could outturn them in almost every other respect. Training at Tonggu was brutal. Many of the volunteers had flown bombers, transports, or flying boats in their previous service, and had never handled a single engine fighter, let alone the temperamental P-40, accidents-claimed aircraft, and tragically, several lives before a single shot had been fired at the enemy. Morale wavered. Pay was inconsistent, often weeks late in arriving from Chinese government coffers strained by years of war. The jungle heat was suffocating, the food unfamiliar, and rumors swirled that the whole venture might collapse before it began. Schnell, aware of the fragile discipline holding his volunteer force together, leaned hard on the flying itself, running his pilots through mock dogfights and gunnery drills from dawn until the heat made further flying unsafe. And then came the nose art. At the suggestion drawn from a magazine photograph of British fighters serving in North Africa with similarly painted noses, the pilots began painting fierce shark mouths onto the noses of their P-40s, rows of jagged teeth and glaring eyes beneath the propeller spinner. It was meant to intimidate. It became iconic. When Chinese newspapers began reporting on the exploits of these American flyers, the nickname stuck almost instantly. The Flying Tigers. A name that within months would be known across America through newsreels and magazine features, even while the unit itself remained technically a private venture unconnected to the U.S. government. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. And with it, any pretense of American neutrality collapsed overnight. Days later, on December 20th, the Flying Tigers flew their first combat mission in defense of Kunming, intercepting a formation of Japanese bombers before they could strike the city. Warned in advance by the Chinese spotter network, pilots scrambled into the air with minutes to spare. It was a resounding success.
Bombers straight ahead.
Several enemy aircraft were shot down for no losses among the American pilots. Word spread rapidly. In a war defined thus far by Allied retreat and Japanese advance. Guam fallen, Wake Island besieged, the Philippines under invasion. Here at last was a victory, however small, that could be celebrated back home. What followed was a string of engagements that seemed to defy the broader collapse unfolding across the Pacific, as Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The Flying Tigers held their ground over Burma and China, flying outnumbered, often outdated, and always undersupplied, yet inflicting losses on Japanese air units disproportionate to their own small numbers. The defense of Rangoon in the early weeks of 1942 became one of the unit's defining chapters as Japanese forces advanced on Burma by land. Their bombers targeted Rangoon's port and airfields relentlessly, seeking to sever the vital supply route that fed war material into China along the Burma Road. a winding mountain highway that had become China's last significant land connection to the outside world after Japan's naval blockade sealed its coastline. Flying alongside a squadron of Royal Air Force Brewster Buffaloes, the Tigers rose again and again to meet incoming raids, often several times in a single day. Pilots climbing back into cockpits still hot from the previous sortie. The toll on aircraft and pilots was heavy. But so too was the toll inflicted on the attackers. Official tallies credited the defenders with shooting down vastly more Japanese aircraft than they themselves lost. Numbers that, even when scrutinized in later years by historians working from Japanese records, reflected an extraordinary exchange ratio for a force so small and so poorly supplied. Life for the pilots between missions was a world away from the polish of military life back home. Airfields were primitive, often little more than dirt strips carved from paddy fields, vulnerable to monsoon rains that turned them to mud within hours and grounded operations for days at a time. Spare parts were scarce, cannibalized from wrecked aircraft to keep others flying. Engines nursed along well past the point any regular Air Force would have condemned them. Radios were unreliable, prone to failure in combat at the worst possible moments. Early warning of incoming raids depended heavily on a scattered network of Chinese spotters. Men and women stationed with telephones and rudimentary radios across the countryside, who would relay sightings of Japanese aircraft toward Kunming and other bases, buying the Tigers precious minutes to scramble into the air. Minutes that often meant the difference between meeting a raid at altitude and being caught climbing beneath it. The pilots themselves were an unruly, hard-living bunch, more mercenary adventurers in the public imagination than disciplined servicemen, prone to disputes over pay and discipline that occasionally boiled into open friction with Sheno's command. Though in the air they proved as capable and courageous as any regular squadron. Among them, men like Robert Neal, David Lee Tex Hill, and Greg Pappy Boyington would emerge as some of the unit's leading aces, their combat records building the legend that newsreels back home were only beginning to broadcast. Boyington, restless and often at odds with Sheno's discipline, would later leave the ABJ before its dissolution, eventually returning to Marine Corps service, where he would add to his legend, commanding the famed Black Sheep Squadron in the Pacific. For the Chinese people, the Tigers represented something beyond mere military assistance. After years of bombardment, with little answer from the skies, here was visible, tangible resistance. Crowds gathered in the streets of Kunming to watch dogfights unfold overhead, cheering each Japanese aircraft that fell trailing smoke when American pilots were forced to bail out over Chinese territory. They were frequently sheltered, fed, and guided back to safety by local villagers at considerable personal risk. An arrangement built on goodwill and gratitude that would pay dividends again and again throughout the campaign. And that stood in sharp contrast to the fate awaiting downed airmen in territory under Japanese occupation. But the strain of constant combat, dwindling aircraft, and uncertain supply lines was taking its toll. By the spring of 1942, the American Volunteer Group was flying with a fraction of its original aircraft strength, patched together from wrecks, cannibalized parts, holding engines and airframes together well past their intended service life. And its pilots were exhausted from months of near-continuous combat operations across a vast and shifting front stretching from Burma deep into southern China. Politically, too, change was coming. With America now fully at war, the awkward arrangement of civilian volunteers fighting under contract to a foreign government could not continue indefinitely. Washington moved to formally militarize the effort, absorbing the group into the U.S. Army Air Forces. On July 4, 1942, the American Volunteer Group was officially disbanded. Its personnel offered the chance to join the newly formed 23rd Fighter Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces in China. The transition was not a smooth one. Many of the original Tigers, weary of military bureaucracy and resentful of the pay cut that came with rejoining formal service, along with lingering distrust of Army leadership after their year as independent contractors, chose to return home rather than re-enlist. Only a handful of the original volunteers stayed on. Yet the legacy they left behind endured. The 23rd Fighter Group carried the Sharkmouth nose art forward, and in time, the name Flying Tigers came to be applied more broadly to the American air effort in the China Burma India theater as a whole. Even as the original volunteer unit passed into history, its brief 7 months of existence disproportionate to the size of the legend it left behind. In just under 7 months of combat, the American Volunteer Group was credited with destroying close to 300 Japanese aircraft, against the loss of a small number of their own pilots in air combat. A handful more lost to accidents and the hazards of operating from primitive fields in poor weather. The disparity, even accounting for the inflated claims common to all air forces in the fog of war, and later moderated somewhat by post-war analysis of Japanese loss records, reflected a unit that had punched dramatically above its weight. A handful of P-40s and volunteer pilots holding a critical line at a moment when Allied fortunes across Asia were collapsing on almost every front. Chennault himself was recommissioned into the U.S. Army as a brigadier general, continuing to command American air power in China through the remainder of the war, eventually rising to major general. His once dismissed theories on fighter tactics, now vindicated by results the whole world had watched unfold in the skies over Rangoon and Kunming. The story of the Flying Tigers endures not simply as a tale of aerial combat, but as a story of improvisation, of a small band of volunteers thrown together with mismatched equipment, inconsistent pay, and little institutional support, who nonetheless found a way to hold the line when few others could. They flew a fighter that was considered second-rate by the standards of its day. They flew under a flag that was not their own. And for a brief, extraordinary chapter in the skies over Burma and China, they became one of the few bright points in a war that, for the Allies, had scarcely begun to turn. Today, the shark-toothed silhouette of the P-40 remains one of the most recognizable images to emerge from the Second World War, reproduced on model kits, museum pieces, and the noses of restored warbirds still flying at air shows decades later. A symbol not just of a single unit's exploits, but of a broader truth about the earliest, most desperate days of the Pacific War. That courage and improvisation, applied with discipline and hard-won tactical insight, could hold back an empire, if only until greater forces could be brought to bear. Thanks for watching this video. For more deep dives in rare and restored historical archival footage, please like it, and if you can, subscribe to our Dronescapes channel to help us grow it together.